Last time I tried to simulate an engine, the result sounded like this. This sounds like audio from an 8-bit game, yet this is 2026. We can do better than that. But first, we need to go back to the start. The reason why engines sound the way they do is mainly because of the travel of gases in the exhaust pipes. Our last simulation designed pipes as single-dimensionless boxes, which is obviously not right. But before building the simulation, I needed a real reference. This is a one-cylinder cultivator engine. The main sound we're interested in recreating is the sort of bubbly high-frequency pop around the exhaust tip. An interesting phenomenon I'm looking into is how the sound depends on the angle and distance you're facing the exhaust. Combustion changes the sound even more. Throttle, choke, and unfortunately, this is one of the hardest engines to simulate correctly, which makes it the perfect test. The first thing we need to start with is writing the new fluid simulation for the pipes. This time I build them as a series of tiny segments, each storing their own variables. But you might be asking, how does gas flow through the pipe then? That's why we reconstruct the left and right values of each interface. The simplest method is just directly using the averages surrounding the edges. Although this works reasonably well, it tends to smooth out the details too much. So I made an upgrade. Instead of flat values, I estimate a slope between cells. But by itself, this method introduces instability and oscillations. So we fix that using limiters. I've implemented 8 of them to be exact. Each one behaves slightly differently, and we get a more detailed result, though it becomes more sensitive to shocks and drastic changes. We can go even further, introducing even more detail at the cost of stability. For now though, first order is already good enough for testing purposes. But even with all that, we haven't figured out how gas actually moves between cells, and that is exactly what's called a Riemann problem. Basically, given the left and right states, what's the flow between them? So I tried the simplest solution, just averaging the 2 reconstructed states. Oh yeah, I forgot. Nobody uses this because it always blows up. So I implemented Roussanov dissipation. With that, the pipe interior is basically finished. Now we just need boundary conditions for the pipe ends. I hacked together something good enough. It'll definitely need revisiting later on. Now comes the part I actually care about, turning this into sound. This was a mistake. I used this approximation for computing sound pressure, but that's not exactly the problem, no. We need to turn those pressures into audio, but wait, what's that sound? Yeah, it happens because we skip audio samples. And why do we do that? Because the fluid simulation requires CFL substeps for it to not become a nuclear reactor. So if we skip the contribution of the substeps, we violate the Nyquist-Shannon sampling theorem. And that is exactly the cause of the crackling. So my first solution was just averaging the contribution of all the substeps. But that adds a new problem. Averaging them is basically a moving box filter, so everything is low-pass filtered. In other words, we lose the high-frequency detail we were trying to simulate this entire time. So basically what happens is our small one-cylinder engines start to sound like a Harley. Remember the more advanced reconstruction methods we implemented. Well, they didn't exactly restore the detail as much as I expected. And this was the moment I realized this problem was way bigger than I thought at first. I was spending weeks chasing it down until somehow I just hit a dead end. I was building tools just to confirm it wasn't my audio pipeline, but I still couldn't figure it out. Turns out, the solution is to correctly reconstruct the substep samples, but then I hit a crossroad. Do I try and stack band-aids on top of my mediocre audio pipeline, or do I completely remake it in a way that it naturally accounts for the substeps? During this time, I realized something else. My exhaust tip has a radius of 1 centimeter, and obviously, the real exhaust is a whole lot bigger. But if overlooking a single mistake wasn't enough for me, I realized the only reason my non-average result sounded closer to the source audio—
This is a test. Is a test. This 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 is a test.
is because I've been plugging in an incorrect delta in the sound pressure formula. So fixing that mistake results in the non-average recording sounding just as bad as the average one.
This is a test. This is a test. This is a test. This is a test. This is a test.
So at this point, with all of this stacked on top of each other, all I can say is, I genuinely do not know. But I might have an idea. If I go through everything one by one, eventually I will have to converge upon the perfect solution.